Hi, this is Dave Ellis, and you are watching the Break It Down Show.
Yes, we are. We are watching the Break It Down show, and I just get to talk to those incredible people. I know, look, you've been a judge for a very notable case, and I guess we have to start a little bit there, just because I think that going past that doesn't do your professional work enough justice. And listen, I
Hmm.
love talking to lawyers who do incredible things. Whether they're writing about the Supreme Court, the legal profession is vast. It is like it's so crazy, so many disciplines, and like you could be a will and trust attorney your whole entire career,
Right.
or a real estate attorney, and never see the inside of a real courtroom at all. It's just such a crazy thing. So when you have someone notable come on, it's always good to start there.
Yeah, it's been fun, and I've been a lawyer. I was a lawyer before I wrote my first book. I've managed to stay a lawyer in various capacities. I've been adventurous in my choices. As a lawyer, I could have just stayed at a law firm and done that. I didn't want to just do that. I want to do some interesting things, and it's been fun to watch my book career sort of parallel my legal career and the things
Yeah.
that I've experienced and learned that I can sort of find ways to insert into the books.
When you live in the Chicago area, my
Yeah.
buddy Blake was an attorney in Vegas when we lived there, and he's like, man, you ought to see how corrupt the system is and how the lying, and there's routinely, at least during this era, were routinely judges, lawyers getting disbarred for all
Yeah.
kinds of impropriety. And then you see someone like Rob Blagojevich. And like when something like that happens in Chicago, it's just not a surprise, right? Like there's whole towns that had to turn over their police force because they were, everybody was
Yeah.
on the take and some are not. When you're a judge in that kind of an environment, or a lawyer in that environment, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, well, so yeah, I was in a funny place when Rod Blagojevich was first arrested. So I was at that point. I was down in Springfield as the attorney for the Illinois House of Representatives, and so as we all know now, and fewer people maybe knew at the time, when you impeach a governor, you start with the House of Representatives. We've of course saw Donald Trump's impeachment and saw President Clinton, but it's a pretty obscure little area of the law. So when the day Rod Blagojevich got impeached or got arrested by the FBI, I knew that everything that I was doing at that moment in time was going to come to a standstill, and there were going to be impeachment proceedings. And so, in fact, I had been writing a book. This is kind of a funny story. I had been, I was in the middle of my writing career, and I'd been writing for Putnam, and I started slowing down. And they said, "Why are you slowing down?" And I said, "Because I'm working down here in the government in Springfield, and we have a crazy governor. His name is Rod Blagojevich." And at that point, nobody had heard of Rod Blagojevich, right? And so my publisher, my New York publisher, said, "Well, is he interesting?" And I said, "Yeah, that's one way of putting it. He's interesting." And they said, "Do you want to write a book based on him?" And I said, "Sure, I'll give that a shot." So I didn't want to be too on the nose, right? But I wrote a story. It's Breach of Trust. That was kind of a character novel about a governor who maybe started with the right intentions and went rogue. Well, I was three-quarters done with the book, and he gets arrested. And they're saying he was trying to sell the appointment to Senator Obama's replacement seat in the Senate. He was shaking down the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Cubs. I'm reading all this, and I said, I'm going to have to rip my book up because reality has become far stranger than the fiction I was writing. I literally had to start over with that book. I mean, that is the perfect example when people say, reality is stranger, truth is stranger than fiction. It
Yeah.
can be.
Sometimes you get a little too close to the reality, even if you make it crazy. My friend Kat Connor writes like FBI crime thrillers, and,
Uh-huh.
and she was basically almost exactly nailed down, depending on what story version of the story you want. The whole COVID outbreak. She picked a different virus, but it gets out of a lab, and oh
Yeah.
my god, it's like. And then this was, I don't know, the book came out in 2019.
Yeah.
So it's like, wow, you really nailed it,
Wow.
Kat. A little
Yeah.
scary. And then
Um,
she purposely, like, how would you get rid of a body? How would you as an author? She researches these things.
yeah.
So like, the FBI was doing like a search, like a search for crazy people. She'd come up for sure. But that is part of your job, right? Is to get as close to and maybe a little out in front of reality as possible.
You
So,
try. Yeah.
yeah. I guess the big question is did you not make your book crazy enough?
I did not make it crazy enough at first, and then I realized that people were going to be comparing my book to the real saga of Rod Blagojevich,
Right.
I had to completely change it. I had to make it much more corrupt, much more sensational.
Yeah.
And the book ended up working out well, but I tell you something, I would, if I could go back and have that not happen, I would be happy to go back and have that not happen. That was really tough for the state. It was really tough for government. And, I would have hoped he would have resigned as soon as he was arrested, but he saw it all the way through, and we had to impeach him. And boy, it was crazy. I mean, he's going on the shows in New York. He's going on The View and all the talk shows and saying we're a bunch of clowns in Springfield, Illinois. We don't know what we're doing. And so my biggest job during the impeachment and then the prosecution, when I prosecuted him in the Senate, was to show that we were being totally fair. We were being reasonable. We were showing him all the evidence. We gave him all the rights you could possibly give somebody, and just trying to carry it with some dignity,
Yeah. Is that possible to do at the national level? I don't think anybody came off as having dignity when the Donald Trump impeachments were happening. I'm being critical of both sides, but
yeah,
it's just too politically infused. It seems like, I don't know, but what do you, as a lawyer, can you pull that off? And like, no, this is on the up and up and this is why, or is it just impossible in a city like that?
It's possible. I have faith in people. And, we didn't, I was not a flashy prosecutor. I said, let's let his own words tell the story, because most of the case against Rod Blagojevich in the impeachment trial and in his criminal case were his own words.
Right.
And so we had him quoted. We had tapes. I'd played the tapes.
Yeah.
And so they could hear him basically shaking down a racetrack owner to get a bill signed. The governor has to sign or veto a bill, and he wanted a bunch of money before he signed it. We played the tape. I mean, how does that lie?
Yeah.
But nowadays, Pete, people might not believe things that are right in front of them. I mean, so dug in with their belief system that no amount of proof can get them out of it.
Well, even like when I talked about Kat's story, depending on what version you believe, there's the lab outbreak and then there's the wet market outbreak, or whatever other ones are out there.
Right.
But you have to say that, like, hey, this is, we don't know. We may never know. But, there's definitely at least two camps, if not 25, right?
There's at least two. Yeah. And they're pretty separate camps. And people are catering to them. And that's the problem, like I look at the media. I used to be a news junkie. I imagine you probably are too. And I would flip around the channels. I would, I'd watch the 24-hour cable, CNN, MSNBC, Fox. And now if you watched an hour of either one of those shows about the same topic, you would think you were talking about completely different topics. Yeah. Because they're catering to their audience, because it's entertainment and it's money. And so nobody is hearing the counter to their position when they're watching any of these channels. It's too bad.
Yeah, not to be two angry old dudes, but I don't even really refer to it as the news anymore, because everybody, including the federal government, they've all just compromised their integrity to such a point that, like, when NBC, ABC, whoever at CNN, when they report something and they're like, so-and-so said this at the White House, especially during the Trump era, I'm like, I just have to listen to the exact words that were said, so that I can hear for myself what was said, and then have you spun this into something else. And way too many times, and I'm like, that is an unfair characterization of what was said. That's going on today with the Biden administration, where they take one little element of something he says or whatever, and it gets turned into this completely different narrative. And so, yeah, I don't actually consume much news anymore. I do my own basic, like if it's a news story that interests me, I'll go out and I'll look at multiple sources. And I feel like even then I'm like, so look, I've got a lot of time in combat zones. And I know from being there and seeing embedded reporters, those guys usually have a story they want to write. And then they're going to meld whatever pieces they can get into that story, even if that story's not at all accurate. And so it's hard to, these are war correspondents. And I'm like, just write down what happened today. It's already amazing and fascinating, but they don't. There's always this bigger thing. And it's like each day to day, they're like a piece of a puzzle. So it's hard to take seriously what these folks say, but it is good fodder for a book.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for holes in the criminal justice system. The system of justice in our country is really an honor system. You trust the judge will be impartial. You trust that the lawyers will at least follow their minimal ethics rules. You trust that the witnesses will tell the truth.
Yeah.
And the police. So you've got a lot to play with if you want a little mayhem, and that's the fun part. And yeah, there's probably a little commentary in some of these books too.
Yeah.
But there's great fun.
Just looking at like the topical stuff still, again, as an author slash, lawyer, we've seen a couple of reporters now fired or censured by their own organization for fabricating the truth. And these are major organizations, the USA Today, the Washington Post. I mean, they're like going, hey, can't do that around here. So maybe we're seeing a correction where some of that sensationalism is being fixed. But the other thing too is a lot of these court cases, as you know, they may go on well beyond the news cycle, and you come to find out, you're like, God, this thing is dirty, but not interesting anymore. And if it's about the news having to correct things, they're not all that inclined to report that stuff.
No. They're the part of the problem is they're feeding their audiences what they want because they need ratings. I mean, I get it. That's always been true, but they didn't seem to be like that before. And
yeah.
But they're struggling. And newspapers, of course, are struggling, and so they're trying to build an audience. And you don't build an audience, unfortunately, by being even-handed anymore.
Yeah, if ever,
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
Yeah, because
I mean, it's been an interesting experience to watch the world the last few years and watch how people can take the same piece of information and feel very differently about it. And you try to continue what I'm sure you and I both try to do, which is respect all views, and respect people's opinions. Sometimes it's difficult, but we have to maintain that or we have nothing.
One of the things that I often talk about is like, because I've been around the world, I've seen what real struggle is, not that anybody's struggle isn't real, but there's a dude who's a fan of the show, and he's from Biafra. Well, you can't point to Biafra on the map. They don't have independence. And so here we are having this fight over who's free and who's not free in our own country. But this guy doesn't even have a country, and you're like, oh my gosh, are we really this bad off, or have we been sold something? Because when I look at my day-to-day life, granted, I live in Orange County, and I'm about to drive across the country. We do this every year for my charity. It's not what I see in the news. I see wonderful, beautiful people all trying to get together to work on a common cause.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's the funny thing is when you get into the zone of this whole, whether it's the media or the people pushing their messages through the media, it's one thing. Then you come back to your own little world and your home and your family and your friends, and you're like, we're all normal people. But then some of these normal people get sucked in when they start talking about those things. You almost see their eyes glaze over, and they've got one position or the other. And you find in a lot of family situations now and friendship situations that you steer clear of these topics.
Yeah.
Or you're going to lose friendships, unfortunately.
One of the things that I've come to realize as an adult is that when both sides are corrupted and lying, you can't sort out when someone is or isn't lying. I remember, and I know you remember this, when Lance Armstrong was going through the whole, I'm a champion, I'm winning, I've never failed a drug test. And you just kind of shrug your shoulders and go, hey, if he says he's not doping, and there's all these people around him that aren't doping, he's not doping until we can catch him. And then you realize the entire industry was thriving on doping and encouraging it. And track and field, it was a lot of these sports, and all of a sudden you realize, well, who wasn't lying? Who wasn't benefiting from this? Like Tagore, it's like, we want our money back from our sponsorship. Did you sell a lot of watches, you guys? Yeah, like, well, you don't get it all back. This is the industry you played in.
Well, you had the same problem with baseball and steroids. There was that heyday where these guys were hitting these crazy number of home runs, and one of them played for the Cubs, and it was fun. And I always figured Major League Baseball probably knew, but things were good. They were making money. They were popular. And so they said, let's just roll with it until someone exposed it. And then they said, oh, we've got to crack down. That was a tough time for baseball. I think a lot of sports, a lot of entertainment, they go through these cycles where they kind of let things happen and everyone's enjoying it. And then maybe there's a little bit of a crash.
So when you construct a lie, big old complex lie, especially, you know, like as a lawyer, and you're trying to pull it out, you know, whether you're talking about A Few Good Men, you know, that great thing. It's like, I want the truth, you know, and everything.
Right.
I don't know how realistic that is, but do people have guilty consciences in these places, or are the stakes too high where if they admit to the truth, it ain't worth it?
Yeah, I mean, lawyers always, lawyers have a canon of ethics that says they cannot lie in court. And what you'll often see in criminal cases is defense attorneys will not ask the question of their client. They won't say, did you do it? They'll ask questions around it, like, what proof do they have? Do you have an alibi for that night? They try to come up with a theory. They can't quite get to lying. They're not supposed to, but they can push a story within the bounds of ethics, without putting someone on the stand who lies. They can push whatever story is best for their client. And so, and clients, yeah, I mean, some of these people do have guilty consciences. There's no question about it. But, the clients, usually they just want to win their case. And so they sort of go along for that ride. And that's the challenge of a system of justice like this. In Italy, in some of these other countries, the judge is basically the investigator and the fact finder, and there's not that much adversarial process. But in this country, we leave it up to the two sides to do their best, throw up their best version, and then a neutral arbiter decides which one they believe. It's as they say, our system of justice is the worst one in the world, with the exception of every other one.
Exactly.
I mean, that's about the best. I think it's probably the best system we can have, but it's deeply flawed in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, I mean, DAs aren't elected on losses, right? Like those guys get there and picked, and it's really challenging. And then you watch a 2020 episode, and granted, this is entertainment, but it is a real story, and you're like, what on earth were these people doing? We watched one the other day about this little kid that gets coerced into, and by the way, if confessions are proving to be way less reliable than we ever thought, and DNA evidence is exonerating people that are on death row, like we have to at some point we have to do the math and say, we can crack down on X, whatever it's going to be, but we're going to put innocent people in jail with the crackdown. Are we okay with putting innocent? Because we know our failure rate, and I don't know what it is, but it's got to be greater than 10%. I wouldn't say it's 50, but it's got to be greater than 10%.
It is greater than 10. It is. There was a point in time in Illinois. Illinois abolished the death penalty, but for a long time, we had it. And at one point in time, there were 16 people on death row, and 8 of them were ultimately exonerated as innocent.
Come on.
Half of the death row. Yeah. And that's one of the arguments against the death penalty is it's irreversible. I mean, it's too late if you find the evidence later. But no, you know what? It's amazing, isn't it? Confessions, eyewitness accounts have been proven to be notoriously unreliable. That, over time, a lot of things will factor into your memory, including being told that you got the right person. Once you identify someone and then they arrest them and put them on trial, and you say, yeah, that must be right. They must have corroborated it. And sometimes they didn't. Sometimes you're it. But you said it already, so you'd hate to think in your own mind that you were wrong, and that creeps in this, I don't want to feel stupid by going back on what I said. No, these are subconscious things, I think.
Yeah.
But they've proven that eyewitness testimony can be very unreliable, and confessions are the strongest piece of evidence against somebody. And a lot of those, I had a client, Pete, who spent 6 years in jail waiting for his trial, and he was innocent. But he signed a piece of paper because the prosecutors and the police told him that if he would just sign this piece of paper, he could go home. And all he had to do, there was a fight that broke out on a street. This was a rough neighborhood. He was there, but he had nothing to do with the fight. And they said, just say you threw one kick, and then we'll let you go home. So he said that. And of course, if you're part of the fight at all, you're part of all the fight. So by confessing to that, he confessed to murder. Spent 6 years in jail waiting for his trial. He was exonerated. He was acquitted at the trial, but lost 6 years of his life because he couldn't afford the bail and because he signed that piece of paper.
There's a lady. It's terrifying, and it happens all the goddamn time. Like there's no 2020 for that poor dude. It's and I wonder, like, instead of a public defender, because I've had a public defender before, and that person had no time for my case. the day of court, they would be there, my public defender, but they had no time to do anything about any of it.
It's tough. Yeah, resources. Yeah,
I'm not banging on her because she's got more cases than she can handle. But it
Yeah.
should almost be like, if the state is going to spend X, you have to spend Y on, the public defendant side of it, and actually give them some resources. Because
I mean, I'll say this for Rod Blagojevich: I don't think anyone's going to make me president of his fan club. I mean, I prosecuted him and got him removed from office. But I will say this: his first trial ended in a hung jury on 21 of 22 counts.
wow.
He was convicted of only one thing, and the government said, "Well, we're going to retry him." Well, the government can retry him, sure. They're allowed to do that. And they're the government. They've got unlimited resources. But he spent all the money he had on his first trial. So he goes into the second trial. He's indigent. He can't afford a lawyer.
Yeah.
And you think, whatever you may think of Rod Blagojevich, that's a pretty tough result for him. They tried him, and he didn't get exonerated, but he didn't get convicted. I mean, a hung jury is a victory for a lot of defense lawyers.
Right.
And yet now it's okay, go time. We're going again right now. And now he has no money, and it's tough. That doesn't seem very fair, does it? I mean,
it doesn't. There's a dude in my circle, pretty wide circle, but he's convicted of murder right now. It's a military case, right? He was tried for the same crime 3 times.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait, that's not supposed to happen. Well, the first time the prosecution won, but they played fast and loose, and they put like the pictures of the victims above his head, and they're like, you can't do that. It's not a fair trial. So then they go back and he wins, and he's out for years and years. And then the military's like, we want a piece of this action. So they call him back into the or he goes back into whatever it is, right? And they're like, aha. And so of all the facts that we know, we don't know what happens. He says no, and it's a standard thing where the police are like, we got our guy, and they stop looking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when they compare his DNA to the DNA under one of the victim's fingernails, not his DNA.
Yeah.
And so you're like, well, what do we? And then when you appeal, you have to appeal on that one little thing. And the government's like, we don't have extra money to blow on exonerating him with DNA to find out, like, who's, or actually, I shouldn't say it's not his DNA. I should say we don't know whose DNA it is, because they won't test it. That's what I should say. That's more accurate, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so you have this thing where, like, oh my God, like this is we have all this money to house him for the rest of his life.
Right.
We have 10. I don't know what it costs, but it can't cost that much more than, maybe it's $100,000. That's a year in jail plus, just get a swab and test it. If you're going to house him for millions, just see. And then, by the way, if it isn't him, who was it?
I know. And we used to see situations in Chicago where somebody would, once DNA came out, because we didn't used to have DNA, right? Yeah. And we would just get your blood and say, well, you have the same type of blood, but that doesn't prove a whole lot. And no, but once DNA came out, all these people in prison said, I want DNA testing. And the prosecutor started fighting it. And I thought to myself, why fight it? I mean, if you're confident of your case, then and if there's a chance that you got it wrong, shouldn't you want to know that? I could never understand why. I mean, I know it would open up kind of a floodgate of cases, but so what? I mean, if it's
innocent people, so what,
Yeah, and if you're guilty, then the DNA test is going to confirm your guilt, and sometimes it did. I mean, these people had nothing to lose in prison. Some of them, they asked for DNA testing, and it confirmed their guilt. Okay, fine. So now we feel better about it. Yeah. But let's not waste any resources that we have to get at the truth. It never made sense to me to resist that. We're better now. I think we're better about it now. But,
and we're getting better, right? Like, we're recognizing these things, but we do on the legal side. And look, God bless those people who are trying to fight these cases and put, evidence together. There's just not I mean, can you imagine being a homicide detective in Chicago? Like, it never stops.
It's a tough job, and they have trouble getting witnesses to come forward because they're afraid and they don't trust the police. There's a real problem with the relationships between the police and the people in the neighborhoods where all the shootings are happening. And now, of course, there's shootings all over the place. We just had that mass shooting in a Chicago suburb yesterday on the 4th of July. It was horrible, and it's reverberating throughout Chicagoland right now. But you've also got these areas like the west side of Chicago, which is not that far from where I live, where there's a horrible amount of violence and the relationships are just broken. We have to find a way to have people trust the police again. Police have a very tough job. Some of them are bad. Take any profession, some of them are going to be bad, right? You're going to have bad judges, you're going to have bad cops, but most of them aren't. Most of them are trying to do a good job, but they've got a thankless job, and they're leaving. A lot of cops are leaving. It's a very tough situation, and it really, I think, ultimately comes down to the trust between the police department and the community, and we've got to find a way to fix it.
How about the internal trust too? I know if you're an Oakland cop, you can't believe anybody above you is on your side. Like it's just,
yeah,
yeah,
you hear about that too, and that's why I think they're losing some good cops, and we need to. That's the last thing we need in a major town like Chicago.
Yeah. You got to have good people out there doing.
But on the other hand, the system's getting better. We're recognizing a lot of problems. We're trying to fix them. The courts are trying to take a lead in it. We had a bad cop who secured a bunch of bad confessions, and a good amount of case law resulted from that said, look, if there's ever anything with anybody beating a confession out of somebody, then we start the trial over, no matter how strong the case was. It's an automatic reversal of a conviction and a new trial. Right. I just overturned a conviction of somebody who spent 27 years in prison. He got the crap beaten out of him, and no one would listen to him. He had records, he had photographs, and it took an appellate. I'm on the Court of Appeals. I'm on the appellate court in Illinois. And even the trial judge said, well, this is coming too late. Where has this guy been? And the answer was right there in the record. He'd been saying it from the day he was first beaten up. Yeah. But nobody would listen. His lawyer wouldn't even fight it. But there were all sorts of records, and they put the police on the stand. The police all took the fifth. They didn't want to answer the question. Did you beat this guy up? I take the fifth. Well, what are you supposed to think when you hear that? Maybe they actually did beat him up. Cops don't beat up most people. It's not a common thing, but it does happen. And when it happens, we have to immediately jump in. It can't be okay. Not for 1 second.
I told you I used to live in Chicago, and we had a homeless person had gotten into our stairwell, and this is Chicago, everybody. So it can be very cold, very uncomfortable to sleep outside in the street. And so we called the authorities, and the police came, and the last thing we wanted was for any harm. We just didn't want this person to be in our dwelling, right? Because that's now the danger's on us, and we have to respond. So it's not our job to do that. And the police came, and there was a lady and a big old dude. And the guy said, "Get up." And as he was saying that, she was dropping a baton on him. And we're like, whoa, what the fuck? Don't just give him a minute to leave, But he literally had 2 seconds to respond, and he hadn't been awake the entire time. So who knows? But you see that, you're like, look, anytime I dealt with the Chicago police, I was like, you're going to catch a beating if you ever get near these guys, One incident forever poisoned my view of those guys. It's so crazy.
It is. And those are some of the bad ones, and there are some bad ones, and they've also, been kind of hardened by their own experiences.
Oh, yeah.
So, No, the life, I've never been a cop. I have not lived that hard of a life, because it's a hard life to be a cop, but, their viewpoints, their experiences, their perspectives are really fascinating to listen to, because you can tell them about the thing you saw when someone pulled out their cell phone and took a picture of them pushing somebody around, and that's not okay, and it should never be okay. But they could say, well, but the last time I dealt with someone in this situation, I was gentler and I got punched in the face for it, or they went for my gun. And so I learned you can't take that chance. And that's why we just need more dialogue between these communities. They need to be talking to each other and say, look, I can't, a cop always says, I can't lose a fight. Yeah. I can't lose a fight. I lose a fight, someone pulls out my gun and runs off with it. I can't lose a fight.
At best.
At best. Right.
There's a case out here in Fresno where a guy was a cop and a perp. I hate to use that term, but the person who was doing the crime, that's why the cop came. They got into a 20-minute fight, hand-to-hand fight, and he was exhausted, and he basically had to pull his gun. And he's like, I had to pull my gun. There's nobody coming to help me. I was completely exhausted, and I feared and at that point, he could say, I feared for my life. I had no backup coming. It was me and this guy, and as far as I knew, we were fighting to the death because he hadn't surrendered in 20 minutes, you know? And
Yeah.
and then the law, and like maybe appropriately so, but they came after him as if he was the bad guy right from the jump. And it's like, man, that's the other side of this thing. We often say, well, the police need more training. Who's got time? Who's going to raise their hand and say, pass a bond measure to pay for a police force that's 25 times, bigger, or whatever, 25% bigger, because when you train harder, you break more bones, you medically retire more people. And it's just, the training person at the police force, any of them isn't like, man, I got so much time and money, I wish I could spend this stuff. Like, those guys are all maxed out. No one's idle on a police force, especially in a place like Chicago. And so we got to fix our expectations. Like Andrew Yang said, every cop should be a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. That's not even realistic,
It would be nice if they could find non-lethal ways to respond. And sometimes they're too quick to go for the lethal force. And, and they're also put on the spot too. I mean, look, everybody knows that. I mean, the people who are most ardently against police brutality, and I think I'd probably be in that category, would also, if they're fair-minded, would say, yeah, no, they have a tough job. Yeah. I mean, and you don't always know where to draw the line. You don't always know when too much is the right, when you've gone too far, or when to resort to that, that more lethal action. And you try to train them, but there's only so much training you can do when that adrenaline is going and you're in a situation and you see, it's tough. I mean, it is a tough situation. It's why I think it's fascinating to write about police and to write about crime. I mean, this book I just did is a suburban cop. And so she has a different experience. She's never done a murder before because no one's ever been murdered in her little town. It's a fair amount like the town I live in. It's not exactly the same because that wouldn't be fun for me, but it's a suburban town, a small population around a bunch of other big towns in Chicago. Because, we have so many suburbs in Chicago. Some of them are 5,000 people, 10,000 people.
Yeah.
And some of the wealthiest towns are the smallest, right around the city. And this is my make-believe version of that. And I've got a cop who's, they're told, be nice to the people, be nice to the residents, because it's a small little town. And then all of a sudden she gets this murder dropped on her, and everyone says, well, you got to solve it right away. We feel unsafe. We're all going to, leave if you can solve it. And she's struggling with some manipulative people who are trying to make her job tough. She's not the focus of the book. But she's a character in it. And I thought, being a suburban cop has got to be a very different experience.
Oh man. I tell you what, being a suburban dad going through a divorce and everything, I got wrapped up into something where there was a paperwork error at the state, which made it look like I didn't have insurance. And no matter what I tried to do, I couldn't fix that. And I hold some culpability in this too. I could have taken it more seriously. But that led to my license being suspended. And I had 2 jobs at the time. One of them was working at a bar because I'm trying to survive this divorce and have enough money to keep the house so we can, all these things are going on.
Right.
And so that meant I would drive from McHenry County to Lake County every day, often late at night when only me and drunks and cops are on the road. And I got arrested in Sleepy Hollow once, if you even know where Sleepy Hollow was. Not for anything wrong, but because of this whole thing. And I'm like, how do I fix this? And the cops would say, hey, listen, not my problem. I called it in. I got to bring you in. Right. And then I had a paper from the court. I have it somewhere in my record still. And it says that, hey, sorry about the mistake. We see that everything's cool with your license and registration, with your insurance, all worries. It's all taken care of and gone. Next paragraph. Because you don't have insurance, your license is still suspended. So I had this argument with itself. And it was this triangle between the police, the judges, and the state. And I would ask the court, please send those papers right now to the state. I had papers sent, certified mail to the state. And I'm like, who do I send it to? Oh, you send it to, David Ellis. Okay, great. And I call up. Okay, great. Did you guys get the papers? And they're like, yeah, it's signed for by David Ellis. Let me see if we got them. No, we don't have them. And I'm like, what am I? And then, Springfield, if you can't drive, it's a long way away. And so you have this whole thing where I keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the penal system. My bail bonds were going up each time. I couldn't fix, and I'm a churner. So this is for the audience. This. I go alphabetically. Oh, hold on. I don't speak a foreign language. Oh, hold on. I also don't have a lawyer because I can't afford them anymore. And I got turned into a criminal in McHenry County The judge was a hard ass. In Lake County, the lady's like, "Oh my God, I've seen you in here a bunch of times. What's going on?" And I told her the story. And she's like, wipe every single thing off his case, right? But the McHenry County judge and the DA never wanted to hear about that. And until I got extradited from Cook County on their warrant when I worked in Iraq. I mean, it's this crazy story. And I got turned into this criminal, and it was over procedural things. And because the three entities couldn't talk and sort it out, and I couldn't convince them that they were, individually turning me into a criminal. Can you imagine like the thing that starts in that? I had to leave the state ultimately because I never knew. I had a conviction that someone went in and said, "Oh, that must be a wrongful." Yeah, I had a ticket that was flipped over, and someone said, "Well, look at all these other tickets. This one must be a mistake." And they turned it something that had been erased, and they brought it back to life. That's what saved me in Lake County because the judge saw it, and you're shaking your head because this is not improbable, and that's these little areas. And then so I got pulled over this one time, and because I work at a bar, I had a bunch of IDs. This is post 9/11, but just barely, and I had a bunch of cell phones because people leave their cell phones, and I would try to return them, and I'd hold on to them so I had them in one spot and I could send them off and everything. So I had a stack of IDs, a stack of cell phones, and this guy thought he caught like criminal number one,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, and it's crazy. So these suburbs have these cops that are doing these impossible things, and everybody's really just commuting through town. But gosh, if you do something bad there, they run out of capacity real fast.
Yeah, it's it's lots of people have stories like that, and it's so frustrating, and the bureaucracy can be crazy. And you see some, it sounds like you at least were able to somehow extricate yourself a little bit from this situation, but you see people not, and you throw your hands up, and there are things like that in the system, and sometimes you don't even know where to turn. I mean, yeah. And I'm lazy. Like when stuff like that happens to me, I think I'm going to be lazy about trying to fix this until somebody makes me fix it. The IRS will send you a note and they'll be like, "Yeah, we didn't receive your tax payment." You're like, "Yeah, I mailed it, so you'll find it eventually." Yeah, and then they send you another one saying, "We still haven't received it." You're like, "I mailed it. It's been paid for. I've got the canceled check. You deposited this, and you're telling me you didn't." Yeah. And you call someone, you get put on hold for an hour, right? And you tell them, and they look up and says, "Well, we have no record." I'm like, "Can I send you, can I email you the canceled check?" "Well, we don't accept email." "Okay. Right. You're going to keep sending me letters? Are you going to put a lien on my house? I have proof that I paid. What do I have to do?"
Taxing thing. I'm like, okay, so the court was fed up with the state, so the court wouldn't cooperate with me to help fix my thing because they're like, "The state always loses stuff." And I'm like, "Well, I'll get the papers." And they're like, "Yeah, you can have it. It's your paperwork anyhow. So here you go." So they sent it over to me, and I called the state. "Hey, I've got the paperwork. I'm gonna bring it down to you like you guys asked." "You can't bring it down." What do you mean I can't bring it down? Like, it has to come from the court. And I'm like, "But they've sent it to you, and you say you don't have it. How do I fix this problem?" "Well, you have to go back to the court." And I'm like, what am I saying? Oh, it's so crazy. It's so crazy. So there's easily a book there where you just get like the falling down guy. And he's like, "I've had it. I'm not allowed to be honest. I'm going to be a criminal."
That was a great movie. That movie really, Falling Down, Michael Douglas, that movie really resonated with people because he just took all those kind of things that just drove you crazy, and he turned into, well, what he turned into maybe wasn't so great, but it was people could definitely relate. Yeah, no, it's crazy.
I want to talk to everybody. So the latest book is called Look Closer. It's by Dave Ellis. It's right there. You see in the link down below. Here's what I recommend. I'll read it with you. So let's buy two. I'm going to buy a copy. You buy a copy, and we'll sell some books. You know that David knows how to write. If you have any doubt, go to his Amazon page or just go to his webpage, and I'll put that link up in a second here. There are so many books. And also he works with, I don't know, one of the most known authors in the world. I mean, James Patterson. Holy cow. How did that come about? How did you get that? Because I've got a number of friends that write for very prominent brands, Tom Clancy, and look, the Clancy family trust or whoever decides that, they don't pick lightweights. They pick people that get what they're trying to do,
Yeah, and Jim Patterson is he is somebody who knows what he wants to do. He likes having co-authors. He says, he likes to bring in different people that bring in different talents and perspectives, but ultimately he knows what his audience wants. That is probably his greatest strength. is he knows what the audience wants. And he says, like he likes the short chapters. If you read a James Patterson book, he has short chapters. He wants a nice, tight, short scene, and he wants something big in each scene, whether it's something funny, something scary, something hilarious. He wants every scene to matter. Just like if you were trying to make the best movie, you wouldn't want any wasted scenes that just sort of advance the plot. You'd want every scene to be great. And but yeah, it's it started with him because my first book was called Line of Vision, and that was back in like the 90s, the late 90s, but he was already a famous guy, and he read it and loved it and always remembered that, and wrote a nice blurb for me that I put on my book. And I'd go around to bookstores and I'd say, "Oh yeah, Jim Patterson was just here. He was talking about what a great book you wrote." And I'm like, I'm a nobody, and he's this great guy. So fast forward, maybe 15 years later, and his former publisher is now a literary agent, and he's my literary agent. And they start talking at lunch about me, and the idea comes up. Should we, maybe Dave could be a co-writer? He said, yeah, I would be interested in that. And so my agent asked me, and I said, well, I write differently than Jim does. I don't write the same. I mean, we're in the same ballpark, but it's slightly different. And he said, well, first of all, you'd be an idiot to say no to this. And I said, well, that's true. But he said, talk to him, tell him how you just see what he says. So I thought that was fair. So I called him, and I was all kind of nervous, and I said, Jim, look, I'm super flattered that you would even consider me, but you've read a book or two of mine. I write quite differently. And I said, I don't know how to write a James Patterson book. And he said, I don't want you to write a James Patterson book. I want you to write a James Patterson, David Ellis book. And he said, I want you to bring your skills. And I think, and I'll hone them, and I'll hone it to make sure it's got what my readers want. But I want you to bring your muscle in too, and we'll put our two heads together. And I think it could be something unique and special. And I said, how do I say no to that? I mean, he's such a good guy. He's so chill about the whole thing. He's uber successful. So I suppose he can afford to be, but he always says, we got to have fun. It's not work. If it's work, then it's not writing. Like he will say, he's fond of saying he hasn't worked for 25 years because he used to work. He was in a big guy in the ad business. He was one of the top creative at J. Walter Thompson in New York. So he was at the pinnacle of the advertising business, and that was work.
Yeah.
He said, this is easy. This is great. This is just fun. And so he always says to me, are you having fun? Are you enjoying yourself? We even stopped something in a book one time when this character was getting particularly dark. And he said, I think we need to lighten this up a little bit. This is not going to be fun for you to write. And I thought, wow, okay. That's an interesting. He said, if it's not fun for you, that will translate. It'll become a chore, and the reader will get that off the page, that this isn't fun for you. You got to like what you're writing. You got to be excited about it. So I learn little nuggets like that from him all the time. He's really, it's been just an amazing experience working with the guy. Really, I can't say enough about it.
Beyond your own favorite authors, like his name is one of the top names in the world, which means ever, in that genre. It's sort of like comedians, where you can be a fantastically successful author and be anonymous. He's not, I mean, he writes with, look at his partners. He's some incredible people, you included. So here's the question then. The guy that convicted in an impeachment, Rod Blagojevich, must be a pretty damn good lawyer and judge. Are you a better lawyer and judge than your author, or the other way around? Because it seems like you're a pretty damn good author.
Well, my wife might push back on this. She thinks I sell myself short as a writer. I think I'm a better judge than anything else.
Okay.
I really get the law. I mean, some people just get things. I mean, I have an instinct for it. The law is supposed to be fair. It doesn't always work out that way, but it's set up that way. And I think it fits right into the way I think. And it feels very natural to me. Writing, I try to write books that are fun to read, and I'm good at plot twists, and I can write some interesting characters. I think I'm getting pretty good at it. Yeah, I do feel like I'm getting pretty good at it. And I've won a couple awards, so I've been lucky. But my wife says I'm too hard on myself. I'm really hard on my writing. In fact, it's funny. You'd think after being at about my 20th novel now that I would write faster. I write slower. I'm more demanding of even my first draft now. Like
Yeah.
I'll sit there and try to think of a way to say it, and people will tell you, well, just write it, and then you can always change it. And sometimes I'm like, no, I got to get it right the first time. I'm making more demands on myself, and I'm being harder on myself, and that's something I did not expect. I figured when I was at this stage in my career, I'd have muscle memory. I would just be able to just crank it out, and I'm writing slower. It's kind of an interesting dynamic that's formed within my brain.
Yeah. Well, you're probably building better cars, though. You know, like you're not cranking out Fords. God bless Fords. But I'm just saying you're making handmade things, right? And and you want to spend some time on this turn. I mean,
I think that's right. And I get a little more perfectionist about it, and it's started to infect my judging too. I mean, my work product as an appellate court judge is the written word. It's my opinion. You know, if you're a trial judge, you make all kinds of rulings. You don't necessarily put a lot in writing.
Right.
That's all I do.
That's
my whole work product is writing a judicial opinion, and I'll pore over it, and I'll spend forever on it. And my clerks will say, you know, how many times are you going to read this? I said, as many as I have to. Yeah. I'll read it 20 times sometimes and keep tweaking because you want to get it just right. It can be a burden sometimes, you know, and it does make you go slower. And there's a consequence to writing slower, right, Pete? I mean, you know, I get less sleep, I fall behind, you know, but that's how I work. That's how I roll.
There's also potentially someone in prison waiting for your response, you know, like it's I mean, I know you carry that weight. You're like, God,
of course you do,
you know, and a comma.
So, you know, one of the things that I try to do when I get a case, a criminal case, I get criminal and civil. I get everything out of Cook County, but that's, you know, includes Chicago. And so I get all the really bad crime. If I get a criminal case, before anything else, the moment I get it, my clerks and I will read it and see if we think that this is likely to lead to a new trial or exoneration. And if it is, it goes to the front of the pile. You can usually tell, and you're not always right, but you try. You try to make people wait in their line. But if you've got something where somebody is, and it happens sometimes, where you think somebody really got a bad trial and they really need this quick, then you put it in the front burner.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think about this. And look, everybody, we don't always just talk about the book because, one, I want you to read the book, but I also want you to see how great David is and how smart he is. And he's a judge and an incredible author working with James Patterson. You've written almost 20 books, for crying out loud. I mean, there's more to you than just what meets the eye. So we have this thing with the Supreme Court right now, and I'm not asking you to make any kind of political statement, but I had a guy named Benjamin Burton on the show. I don't know if you know his work. He's a professor, probably at Yale. And he writes books, and he wrote a book about how, like, singular the Supreme Court justices have become, where they either go to Ivy League school or Stanford, and that's really about it. And so a guy like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, you know, all these people, they all are in the same room. They've clerked in the same buildings. Maybe they politically don't align, but these people, Alito and all of them are like 98% the same person, just with a different political bent. And he says, hey, we need to get some people like you who've lived somewhere like in the Midwest. You are also an author and have some like American style richness to us, right? Like, and I think we are at that point where I'm not saying these folks aren't brilliant at the law, but they are brilliant at one point of view of the law. And I think we need to open that pipe up a little bit because we're getting a little bit too left and right and not more like practical. Sometimes you want that business owner to be like, I've been a business owner. I understand this case from that guy's point of view. I know what the law says. Here's how I'm going to judge. What do you think?
I think that's 100% right. I think the court is way too monolithic. I've got a line at the beginning of this new book, Look Closer. The protagonist, one of the protagonists, is a guy named Simon, and he's a law professor, and he's a very progressive law professor. That's the character that I thought was the right character for this role. And he makes a comment at the very early on in the book. Why do a bunch of old white men think they know what it's like for a black kid to get pulled over by the cops at night? And the truth is if you go through the history of the Supreme Court, and even in modern times, you know, going back to maybe the year 95 or 2000, pretty much none of those people have ever been pulled over by the police.
Yeah.
They have no idea what it's like. And they're writing all sorts of stuff about the dynamics. and what constitutes a search and what constitutes a seizure.
Yeah.
And there is no substitute for having lived a life that has experienced some of these things. And if you get just a bunch of old white men who went to Harvard or Yale, I mean, there was a time where 8 of the 9 judges on the Supreme Court went to Harvard or Yale, literally just one of 2 schools.
Yeah.
That is crazy, Pete. It's nuts. And, you know, people talk about diversity and they say, oh, you know, we need Black people on the Supreme Court. We do. And we need more women. And it's not just because we want to have people of diverse, it's because of their perspectives that they bring. And, you know, Ketanji Brown Jackson, I guarantee you, she knows what it's like to have been pulled over. She knows what it's like to walk into a Nordstrom department store, at the time probably a respected judge, and have a security guard follow her around because you got to watch the Black lady in case she shoplifts. I'll bet you she has that story, because I have a lot of Black judge friends now. I've been on the court now for 8 years. I know a lot of African-American judges. They all have that story. I don't mean some of them. They all do. The things that they tell me they experience on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
You know, they get into a swimming pool and all the white people kind of edge away from them.
Yeah.
I mean, crazy stuff, right? And these are their stories.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, if you just have one monolithic court, you can't talk about life. You can't, you know, life experience matters more than a law degree. And people are starting to figure that out. It's a little bit too late now. This court is a very ideological court. It's the most ideological court I have ever witnessed in my lifetime. And it might be the most ideological since the 1930s. And by ideological, I mean, you know, they're very academic and they have very set views on things. And I think we know which direction they go. Whether I agree with that direction or not, maybe I wouldn't say, but they do have a direction and it is showing. And it is frightening to some people. So you are exactly right. Your guest from whether it was Yale or wherever is exactly right. We really need to put judges on the court who have life experience. It's amazing what you get when you see that. They can come at things from a totally different perspective.
If Pete was president, one of the things he would do, and Pete is nonpartisan, and I mean that, like I don't lean left, I don't lean right, I just stand up straight. I disagree with myself all the time. I am a hypocrite. All those things go into this mix, right? But I would say, one, I think mechanically we need to expand the court because we are a bigger place. We are a more diverse place, and we have the same size court that we had before. And I'd rather have the court hearing more cases. What I'm not saying is pack the court. And then if I take Benjamin's example, he's like, these guys used to ride circuit. They used to go do other things and maybe come back to the court. And that's what I would want to see is like, okay, we're going to have 21 judges. It's going to rotate. It's not going to be a political thing. It could be random, whatever you want it to be. But these 9 judges are going to do this. And these 4 judges are always going to be out doing something else, or however many judges you get. 9 of them will always be out on some kind of fellowship sabbatical kind of situation. And some of them are going to be out riding circuit and just getting to be out of the damn DC Northeast and going to see what it means to live in. I'm going to go to Terlingua, Texas in a couple of weeks. That has nothing to do with New York City and DC out there and how they live and what they have to do. You know, their access to guns. There is nobody out there that's going to save them except for themselves and maybe their neighbor, right? So they live in a totally different world. And these judges, we've just got to see more of that and spend less time about ideology and more time what it's like to be a human in these real places.
You know, what's interesting is speaking to this perspective thing is, you know, you mentioned that Neil Gorsuch is from Colorado and he has a fair amount of experience dealing with the Indian tribes in those territories. And, you know, Neil Gorsuch is obviously a very conservative judge. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I don't think there's any denying that he's extremely conservative. And he usually joins 4 other judges who are like-minded. But you know where he breaks from them? On the issue of tribal rights.
Sure.
where he just did it, and he's done it more than once. Now, why tribal rights? Well, he has a different life experience when it comes to that, because he lived out there by some tribes, and he had some experience with that area of the law. And so suddenly it has colored his view a little bit. Now that is, I think, exhibit A as to how this stuff can really make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. That experience. And then also, I'm not a judge, you are, but at some point, if I'm on the jury, I could do that. I would be open and say, I've seen 2020. I've seen how many times you guys get this stuff right. Until you knock me over with evidence, my bar for, what's a conviction, it's going to be really high. I don't trust you, DA. I don't trust you, person. And because we have said it in the wrong spot from what we've seen evidentially. I mean, half of the death row people being exonerated, that doesn't, you didn't leave one out again. I mean, look, there's certainly absolute lock cases. And even, I remember, this is the irony, and this is where like it all gets confusing. There was a fairly recent, several years ago now, but fairly recent time where you had 2 death row executions in the nation coming up at the same time. One was an all-night candlelight vigil. We still don't know. I believe that guy was executed. We still really don't know 100% for sure if he did it or not. You don't often get that. The other guy was from Texas, and he hooked up a black man to the back of his truck, and he drug him to death. And that guy, nobody cared if he got executed, because we knew that was the wrong. That guy needed to die. And you have these things. It's not easy. So are you able as a judge to say the Indians have had a bad shake almost every time we've put rocks in the bag and decided who won something? I mean, every single time. So I am Neil Gorsuch. I am going to give these guys the benefit of the doubt, because it hasn't been fair to them for most of history.
Yeah, I mean, I think judges are human, and it colors it. Their life experience, their personalities color how they interpret the Constitution. I mean, the people who are more progressive, who interpret the Constitution to give more rights to women and minorities, are often people who also, in their political views, and it should be different. What the Constitution, how you interpret the Constitution and what you think politically really should be separate. Theoretically, they should be separate. In other words, you could be pro-choice, but also think Roe versus Wade is wrong, and there is no constitutional right to abortion, or the opposite. You could be very ardently pro-life, but think the Constitution gives a right to an abortion. But how many people actually split those two things? Very few, I think. Very few. I mean, I read this Supreme Court opinion, Dobbs, that overturned Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
And I don't think the people writing that opinion made it much of a mystery what they thought of abortion. I mean, Clarence Thomas didn't, and I don't think Sam Alito did either. And I felt like there were some. I mean, it was a long opinion, and you can think of it what you want, but there was unquestionably some very hostile words about the procedure itself, and whether it's taking an innocent life. And I thought, in other words, what I'm trying to say is it didn't sound very constitutional to me. It sounded like they don't like abortion, and that's okay, but that should have nothing to do with the analysis. But it does. It usually does with people, because you can't turn off that part of your life. You can't turn off that part of your brain. You try. The hardest thing to do for me as a judge is to overturn a conviction when I think the guy was guilty. Or maybe not overturn the conviction when I think he's innocent. I'll get cases sometimes where a jury convicted someone, and I'll say, this isn't really all that strong enough. I mean, I can't overturn it on that basis, but I have some doubts. Now, if I have some doubts about somebody being convicted, whether they got the right guy, in other words, am I going to be more likely to react to a trial error by giving him a new trial? There are a lot of people that think judges do that. Alan Dershowitz talks about that. Alan Dershowitz says in a criminal appeal, because he's kind of an expert on criminal appeals,
right?
He said, my biggest job usually is to convince the court that my client didn't do it. Because then if they think that, they're more likely to rule on one of my legal issues, even if that's not my legal question.
Right.
Because you soften the ground so much. Because people inherently want to do what they think is right. And so that's all psychological. I mean, what Alan Dershowitz said, that's all just about the psychology of the judge. But I think we all want to go to bed at night thinking that we dispensed justice, right? We did the right thing. And
It's boy,
it's not it's not a sanitized process. It can't be.
yeah. And when you unseat law like Roe, whatever you think of it legally and you know politically and everything else, it is going to just like when the court backed off pretty hard on like, hey, we're not going to get involved in this election. It's just it's a little bit too crazy, right? And that's not a statement of political. That's a functional thing. And I think Clarence Thomas rightfully called his peers out in the dissent, saying, if it wasn't then and it isn't there, when can we have this conversation, right? And so we do have these things, but does the court need to get involved in these things? And abortion is so tricky. And I think ultimately, if Pete was the judge, I would think most everybody is prepared to say somewhere in the middle, there is a point where some of the load of rights starts to transition to this unborn kid. It's not at 10 weeks. That's too early. But it's certainly not at, like, you can't kill kids after, I don't know, 40 weeks. That seems barbaric, right? Like, and so somewhere in the middle.
I mean, it is the single toughest political issue that I have ever seen. And it's even in how you view it, you know, from whose viewpoint. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a woman, and you know, she finds it very interesting that 4 of the 5 judges who overturned Roe are men, and the 5th one is, of course, female, but also belongs to a well, she's her you know, some people have questioned what her religion says about the role of women. I'm not personally an expert on Amy Coney Barrett's religion. I know that it's an issue. I don't know that much about it, so I don't want to act like I do.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, you'll hear people saying things like, if men could get pregnant, there'd be no abortion restrictions. And I think that's true. I think if men could get pregnant, we would have not one restriction in the entire country, because almost all of them have been passed by men. And that's just a fact. But that's an interesting fact. And it's an interesting fact to a lot of women, you know, that, you know, this is a right. It's the only right that I can think of that is unique to one gender. And it's the gender that traditionally has not enjoyed very much power politically. I mean, women weren't even allowed to vote until the 1920s.
One of the things that puzzles me, and I don't want to keep us too long, but interesting that it's also, this thing also, it devalues the rights of men in general. You're either compelling or denying a father the right to make that decision as well, which is, I mean, I don't know, maybe that isn't a big deal legally, but it seems to sit, not because I'm a man, but like if someone's like, hey, but I want to be a dad, you know, or, hey, this is a one-night stand. Neither of us went into this with the intention of being a parent. And then you're compelling someone or denying. We don't ever even seem to consider that. And it can't be completely ignored. It's got to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, there is so many facets to these questions, and it's brutal. And it's very hard to talk about without people getting upset.
Oh yeah, right.
But yeah, it's been tough, and it's not going away. And
I thought it was all fixed.
It'll be interesting to see what the political response is.
Yeah,
whether there is one, you know, because I know a lot of Republicans are nervous now that there's going to be a real push for people who would have supported Roe and choice to now more than ever try to, you know, galvanize their voters and all that. But from a societal standpoint, it'll be fascinating to watch.
For sure. And I'll say this, and then I'm going to throw the last word to you. You know, if the Republicans got their way to save all these babies from their point of view, well, they damn well better be prepared to continue to do more things about it. I'm glad to make abortion more rare through sane ways, but I haven't seen a lot of sanity from the right either. So, you know, it's just an evolution, you know.
It's frustrating. What's frustrating to me, and this is pretty much what you just said, is that when you look at the states that are implementing bans and that had trigger laws that automatically went into effect, there are also many of the states that refused expanded Medicaid to help poor people who do not have they have low taxes, which is fine, but then they don't have any child care programs for the poor.
Right.
And so if the idea here is to compel women to give birth, and it's going to be poor women who can't travel to another state.
Right.
Wealthy women are still going to do what they want to do. It's
Yes.
the poor that are not going to be able to. And so if you're going to literally force women to have babies, can you at least help them? And I hope people will be consistent in that regard, because it's very disturbing.
Hey, let's close out by saying this. Everybody should Look Closer by David Ellis. He's an incredible author. He's also authored with James Patterson. And so he's good. He's getting nearly 20 books produced. And this is the latest one. He's a judge. He's a badass. He writes incredible books. His wife says he's a better writer than he is. He says he's a better judge. TBD. We'll have you come back the next time you have a case. Anything in closing it up? By the way, thanks for stepping in on all that stuff. I think it's important and fascinating.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I can talk about this stuff all day, Pete. And by the way, just, I will say about Look Closer, all these heavy things we've discussed, Look Closer is a beach read. It's the first time. I wrote it during COVID, and I thought, you know what I will feel like doing right now during COVID? I feel like having fun. So it's a murder mystery that's a puzzle. It's a game, and everything you think ends up not being what you think. Everything gets turned on its head. It's not heavy. It's a light read. It's a beach read. And it's the first time I actually set out to write a beach read. Because I think, Pete, we could maybe use a little levity in this country.
Oh, please, there's always time.
A little fun.
There's always time for levity. All right, let me stand by. Let me wrap this thing up.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours